Welcome back to Brazil Crypto Report. Today I talked to Michael Casey, who's an author and journalist who's been active in the cryptocurrency space for more than a decade. We talk about his 6 years covering Argentina's economy and financial crises, and how these experiences led him to embrace Bitcoin. So we are here today with Michael J. Casey, who was the first mainstream media crypto reporter back in the day with Wall Street Journal. He's written several books on crypto. He was the chief content officer at CoinDesk. He's got a new book coming out as well. He's also my former boss and a good friend. So Michael, it's great to have you on the show.
It's a pleasure. I've been waiting to do it for some time, Aaron. Excited. Yeah.
Awesome. So the reason I wanted to invite you on the show here is because your initiation into crypto actually came kind of during or it was at least prompted by your experience living in Argentina. Mm-hmm. And you lived in Argentina. You dealt with a lot of these, just like inflation and there's just like foreign, money transference issues, and had all sorts of kind of crazy experiences on that front, and pulling your hair out and whatever. And then once you discovered Bitcoin, you're like, oh wow, like this actually solves these problems I was living through as a foreigner in Argentina for all those years. And that was sort of your red pill moment, I guess. And you've been, obviously like following what's been happening in there for quite some time. So I wanted to kind of get your story and on that, and also hear about your reflections on Argentina as well, as which has really been held up as kind of a model for crypto adoption, stablecoin adoption, just globally now. And obviously this is Brazil Crypto Report podcast, but we also focus on neighboring countries, and Argentina is obviously one of interest. So with that, I would just love to have you just introduce yourself, maybe really quick, like brief flyover of your background and what are you working on right now?
Yeah. Okay. Hi. Yeah. Great to be on the show. Excited for this. Journalist, author, podcaster. I do the Money Reimagined podcast weekly basis with Sheila Warren, who's the Council for Crypto Innovation and my longtime co-host of the Money Reimagined podcast. And for some time, until quite recently, was the chief content officer at CoinDesk, as you mentioned, Aaron. But I spent a lot of time at Dow Jones and the Wall Street Journal, which is what led me to spend 6 years in Argentina in the 2000s, and a little bit of time at MIT, where I was part of the digital currency initiative between my time at the Wall Street Journal and then at CoinDesk. And now on my own a bit, I'm still working with CoinDesk. I'm the chair of Consensus, the annual event that everyone should know about. Aaron, of course, knows it very well because you were actively involved in programming it for some time. And I am sort of just acting as an ad hoc advisor to CoinDesk and to the Consensus team. So that's that. I've got a startup of my own that I'm now launching in the Web3 filmmaking world. We're going to fix the whole problem of Netflix and its streaming model and the costs that it imposes on producers and so forth. And some other time I can talk about that because I'm excited about it. But yeah, I mean, Argentina is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. I have and did sort of feature a fairly long story in the Age of Cryptocurrency, which I co-wrote with my Wall Street Journal colleague Paul Vigna, the first book I wrote about crypto back in 2015. And there's a story in there about me trying to get my money out of Argentina when I sold my apartment, and that experience led me to really think hard about the problem of money and governments and what the concept of trust is within all of that. So I can go into that in this conversation, but needless to say, just to talk about Argentina briefly, I refer to it in that passage in the same way I always do, which is I have a true love-hate relationship with the place. Some of my dearest and most beloved friends are from Argentina. And there's a story behind why I think that notion of how friendly you become and how close you become to people also often goes hand in hand with how completely and utterly dysfunctional the actual political and civil system is, right? Like this is a common trait that we see in other places. Italy is a similar one. Strong bonds of family and friends, because you have to build systems of trust somehow. And if the government and the public space is not being there for you to work in a functional civil way, you end up globbing onto these other systems of trust. And so I think it's one of the reasons why very strong bonds get formed. And again, that leads to what I said was a love-hate relationship with Argentina, a place that I had such a great time living in and made very, very good friends and felt really hard saying goodbye to, but ultimately felt like I just had to get my kids out of there because I didn't think that they should grow up in such a dysfunctional place.
Maybe why don't you recap with just maybe the story that you highlighted in your book about just you're trying to sell your house and get the money out of the country, and you ran into just a whirlwind of problems that really illustrated to you perhaps a lot of these problems that folks from the, I guess we'll call it like the developed world financial systems don't generally encounter, right? Like these things just kind of generally work. Yeah. Where, okay, I just press the button and the money gets transferred and I don't have to worry about it, right? Yeah. But then once you come to some of these other countries, look, this is not just generally the way things work in most places, right? Mm-hmm. So it's nice to have sometimes these anecdotes. Like I was joking the other day with a friend. It's like sometimes I like the fact when I have to send a bank transfer, right? Because it just reminds me of okay, this is a horrible experience and this is why we need crypto. I need a periodic reminder, right? But I would love if you could maybe kick off just by telling the story.
I think most people who would probably have a similar response. No one likes doing bank transfers. Why? As it always feels like you're being gouged, right? And it's always this sense is this really sending all this information and providing all these details, these bank accounts and everything else? And it's just, you get a double check, someone calls you. It's really always a problem, no matter where you do it, particularly an international wire. It's really, really complicated. But it's just doubly, triply, quadruply more complicated in a place like Argentina. And before I tell the story, let me just give a bit of a background as to why, right? So in a place that has not just a sort of a contemporary currency crisis, but a long, deep-seated mistrust in the monetary system, so that it's almost like a feature of life in the country not to trust the local currency because you don't trust the government to maintain the monetary policy and to therefore not use it as a vehicle to debase and raise its own funds. Then that sort of deep-seated mistrust leads people to always consistently seek out other stores of value for their wealth. And the way it's typically worked out in Argentina is it literally in dollars. And by that we mean cash. US greenbacks. That is how people save their money. Not under mattresses. They put it, but it's similar to that idea, right? It's actually held for many people in security safe boxes, which are actually run by banks. And so one of the biggest businesses for banks, and also these things called casa de cambios, which are quasi banks used to move money around, is to store your dollars in a safety deposit box, in the same way that Swiss banks, for example, traditionally would hold wealth in these capacities. So you actually still see heists in Argentina of the type you don't see anywhere else, because people literally go, and there's a lot of famous ones when I was there, people breaking in and pulling it off and stealing large amounts of cash from all the safety deposit boxes. And it's just a bizarre situation. That is what happens, is people's default is to hold dollars. And then in the 2003 crisis, which came after a long period in which you were allowed to literally sell dollars for cash, everybody defaulted to dollars, and the entire economy was dollarized. And so when they turned back to pesos, it was just so destructive, because you had to sort of actually deny people the rights to their dollars that were held in these bank accounts. And that just forced everybody even more into the cash economy. So fast forward to 2009, actually it was 10 when I'd left the country in 2009, but I still owned the property, and then sold it when I went back to Argentina to do that transaction and bring my money out. That stage, Argentina had gone through what it typically does, is another cycle. Once the government had devalued and created the peso economy again in 2002, they then just ramped up fiscal spending and had put all these ridiculous constraints on things, and then inflation inevitably came back, and that's when they led the government to put in capital controls, limiting how much money you could take out of the country, which then led to something that became known as the blue rate versus the official rate. The official rate was the government's rate for the exchange rate, but because the real rate was significantly lower for the peso, that was called the blue rate. And there was this arbitrage, this difference between the two. But to stop people from exploiting that and everything just like going to hell from the government's finances, they restrict the money that could be shifted out of the country. Yet there's always ways to work around. Like, so, everything is quoted in dollars, right? So this is the weird thing. This is a peso economy. The government requires you, if you're moving money in and out and around the place, you have to have pesos. But everybody's doing their transactions in dollars, especially for real estate. So went to go sell the house, and I'm told, right, here's a way in which you could move the money out of the house. You go to this Casa de Cambio, and that they will essentially facilitate this transaction and transfer it for you. There'll be some sort of fee involved, et cetera, et cetera. And it's, everybody does it, but it's a quasi black markety thing, right? But I was told, oh, hey, in your case, it's fine because you have this official document that you could use, and therefore you could actually transfer the money directly to yourself. And so we're like, okay, great. But the seller, the buyer wanted to pay in cash. That's what they had. So we sat in this room, big lockbox place, high security, and the seller pushed over, the money to me, and I gave them the keys, and we signed off on this process that was run by and overseen by something called an escribano, a person that acts as like a notary, and then moved the money over, deal signed. I am now supposedly the physical possessor of the money. They are the possessor of the house. I've never seen a stack of money like this before in my hands. This is my life savings, basically. And then the coach says, all right, now you've got to move this out of the country. And I'm like, okay, well, we'll do what you do. I'll get you to transfer it for me through the Swift transaction, et cetera, et cetera. And they said, no, actually, we realized we made a mistake. It has to actually go through the banking system, which means you have to convert it into pesos and then back into dollars, which would mean like a whole bunch of massive losses because of the exchange rate, because of everything just would have just been, I would have had at least 50% of my money just evaporate in that process, not to mention the fact that I would have to have carried the money in a suitcase or something.
Like a wheelbarrow, to the bank, right?
Walk into the bank. the only time I actually used a commercial bank in Argentina was a local Citibank branch, the Citibank Argentina, not Citibank US, which I'd used in the US. And I used it to pay my electricity bills. That's the only reason I had. So like to walk in there and go, hi, it's me. It's a few $100,000. And I just want to just move it quickly out of here. It's just all the red flags, everything just wouldn't have worked. So we ended up. These guys said, "Well, here's another thing we could do, but we can't do it through. I can't give you any documentation." And so it was moved. And I thought about it, and I just didn't trust them because they'd misled me, and I didn't know what to do. But ultimately, I had to just roll the dice, and they basically said, we'll take it. You have to trust us. It's going to land in your bank account in 3 days. And they said, in a day, tomorrow, you can come down and we will give you a Swift code. And with that, a tracking code. And we can then determine, you'll be able to track and check with your own bank that it's in motion, and you'll have some security and some peace of mind within a 24-hour period. And I was like, geez, 24 hours. Of not knowing. And I said, can you just give me at least something, some piece of paper? And they printed out, those old, it's just a calculator with the ticker on it. And it just basically was the amount by the exchange rate, multiplied by the exchange rate, and then the figure of what that was in pesos. And they said, here, that was my documentation. And so this is my life savings. I spoke to my wife that night. She said, how'd it go? And there's no way in the world I could have told her what we were facing that night. I just said, it's fine, a bit of a hiccup, but I'll find out about that tomorrow morning. And I went down the next morning, I went down with this friend of mine who'd set up this relationship with these guys because they were the same. He was a client of theirs. And, I went to them and went to the front desk to say, hey, I want to talk to Claudio, and I need to, confirm that this Swift code is there and I can track it. And they said to me, he's not here, so and so. And I said, all right, we'll try him. And then they came back and said, no, look, your money's in your bank account. Stop asking questions. I said, no, it's not. They told me to take 3 days to get the bank account, but one day I said, no, your money's in your bank account. And that by that stage, I just immediately start with all the conspiracy theories that in fact I've been robbed. The escribano who'd signed it had in fact somehow engineered this so that the money would never actually have gone anywhere. I've been robbed. Everybody's in on it. I'm just getting completely and utterly paranoid because there's not the message I'd been told. And I went outside into the street though, and I called my bank in the US just to check. And they said, wow, yeah, your money's here. And it was an enormous amount of relief. Later on, I don't know how public I should be about all of this stuff. Whatever. This is the world works in Argentina, and it is by no means a secret that this is the way it works. But ultimately, yeah, I mean, we had somebody somewhere on somebody's behalf put some money in my account and got, it's like like the Hawala system basically. It's just just trust, just human trust.
Right.
So that's the long story, but like it's all about trust, right? You have to, who do you trust? You trust the custody company, they trust their client. It's just, you've got to move money around through these systems of trust. And when the government breaks down, when there's no actual sort of like system-wide notion of trust, you have to build all these other mechanisms to do so.
And so on that point, like maybe talk about how that whole experience like informed your maybe your understanding of Bitcoin when you like what was like the aha moment when you found Bitcoin, and how did that story that you just told sort of play into that aha moment?
Yeah. So as I said, right, like our monetary systems, the pre-Bitcoin fiat system, depends upon a trustworthy agents, and they themselves have to roll up into a system of trust. And so if you've got a government that you trust, and then underneath that you have a regulatory framework, and you have all these other players, and these agents are representing you all. Every bank is operating on your behalf, but you feel like you can trust them because you know that ultimately the regulators will ding them. And at the end of the day, the entire monetary system rolls up to something that is not completely debased and non-trustworthy. Then it kind of works, albeit with all the frustrations that we were describing before. So I knew, having written about Argentina all its problems for 6 years, that system just didn't work, that this is why you had 2 exchange rates and all these other things, that ultimately the government model from the top was broken. And therefore, that's why I was in the situation I was in. And that's why Argentina is in this constant cycle of boom and bust and crisis, because there's no trust in the monetary system, because there's no trust in the government. And so suddenly then, it was 2013, I'd been writing about the European financial crisis at the time. I have a habit of just going to cover crises.
Yeah, like one fire to the next, right?
People stop following Casey around because he's bad luck. I lived in Indonesia during theirs, and then I was in the Argentine crisis, and then the year that I came back to the US was right in the middle of the big global financial crisis that then morphed into the Euro crisis, and there was a big story about Cyprus at the time and the freeze on the Cypriot bank accounts, and that's what suddenly put Bitcoin onto a lot of people's radar. This is like mid 2013. And so I wrote a column about it thinking, well, God knows what this Bitcoin thing is, but that's interesting, but what the hell? And it wasn't a very good piece. And then I got a phone call from Jeremy Allaire, or at least an email from his people and from other people, Barry Silbert, a bunch of others. Mickey Malko was there. Raj Date, who was formerly of the CFPB, which I thought was very interesting. And they said, come to dinner and we're going to talk to you and a bunch of other journalists about what this Bitcoin thing is. And I was first of all struck by the fact that it wasn't a bunch of crazies. These were all established investors, former public officials and so forth, who were there to talk about why it's important. And then the second thing was somebody, I can't think it was Barry, who just said, look, think about this from a developing world perspective. And just, how it resolves this challenge, this sort of original sin problem of a lack of trust, which isn't always, by the way, the developing country's problem. It can be caused by the colonial power of the past, or just by being stuck within the whole maelstrom of US policy that can send things awry. But the establishment of trust is really difficult if you're a small little country in the middle of nowhere. But of course, it immediately rang true for me because of how much it spoke to the Argentine experience. And I just suddenly went, wow, a monetary system that gets its trust from math, not from a government. That's amazing. And then I saw how all the ability to move, transfer money back and forth without the intermediary, without that casa de cambio in the middle, or the bank, or the whomever. And I saw the whole thing from that perspective and went, this is far bigger than anything it solved a lot of the things I've been trying to understand for how do you fix Argentina's problems. People say, well, our politicians are corrupt, so we just need non-corrupt politicians. And I was like, that's not going to happen because the entire system is corrupt. There's no way to fix Argentina. I don't know how you fix Argentina's politics because it's such a vicious cycle that it's so deeply ingrained. It's almost impossible. I mean, it's corrupt because it's corrupt. You can't imagine a good guy fixing it. I wish Javier Milei all the best, but I have very little confidence because there's plenty of people who've walked in and wished these things before them. So anyway, that's my perspective on Argentina. And all of a sudden, there was a system to me that was like different. So that's what it was. I was like, big. From then on, I was really, really interested.
I love this anecdote because a lot of the way that Bitcoin is framed among maybe kind of, the Bitcoin influencers in the communities, it's kind of like an opt-out for the individual, right? And in the way that you're kind of it's like, okay, this is the way you can opt out of, your monetary system or your government or your society or whatever. Mm-hmm. Like the way you weren't like, oh, well, I can finally like rid myself of these financial institution tyrannies that have been plaguing me. But you're like, wow, like this could be like a solution. You basically experienced this massive, mm-hmm. Like just financial, like what's the even word I'm looking here? Just maelstrom, mm-hmm. which is what it's like bad as you can possibly get. You've been living in the middle of this for 6 years, just wondering like, how does anybody, like, what can you even do about this? And it's like, oh, wow, here's something that could actually work, right? That this could actually be the solution that we're looking for that nobody else has been able to identify.
Yeah. And remember, it wasn't just the fact that I lived it. I mean, I was perfectly placed because I've just been covering foreign exchange markets for 15 years. That's what I do. I mean, I'm a macro, I was, and I suppose I still am a macro, journalist. I covered the IMF and the G7 and the bond markets and the currency markets. And I understood it all from a political, economic, financial perspective. That's what I do. That's what I did. So I always see this from that, like, okay, what is the problem? How can it be solved? And the problem is that big societal issue. So yeah, it's as much of an intellectual curiosity as it was a personal one. But all of that sort of, the personal experience just made it all the more acute in my mind.
And Argentina has kind of circled back into the maybe the front page of the crypto narrative these last few months with the election of Milei, and a lot of the Bitcoin guys were really excited about him, even though it doesn't at the time it didn't even appear that he was even really pro Bitcoin or even really a believer in Bitcoin. But his worldview certainly aligned with those of a lot of like the hardcore kind of Bitcoin libertarian type guys, Austrian school type guys. And would just kind of be interested in your thoughts on like, I mean, he's proposed some pretty radical things, right? He's done, we don't have to get in like super detail on like, evaluation of the Milei administration here, but like he's proposing some pretty radical things. And, is this something, is there a path forward for Argentina under like this, kind of like shock therapy treatment that he's proposing here? Like, is there a way for, I don't know. I mean, kind of open-ended question here, but like, is there like a way forward here?
It's not like it's a new playbook. I mean, Domingo Cavallo in, I think it was 1993, Argentina had come out off the back of an extreme hyperinflation experience under the Alfonsín regime. Maybe it's 1991. In any case, it was in the early 90s. And Domingo Cavallo, was the economy minister, became a rock star because it seemed fixed inflation, and he pegged the peso to the US dollar, basically under what's known as a currency board, as opposed to just like hey, the government's going to say this is the level. What happens is under a currency board is you create essentially a straitjacket. It's a constitutional commitment that cannot be broken, that there will always be the equivalent held in, it's like a gold standard, but in this case it's tied to the dollar. The absolute equivalent will be held in dollars, at the central bank to backstop the value of the peso at this fixed rate. And in Argentina, Hong Kong has one, it's had one all of it for however many decades now. In Argentina, in Hong Kong, it's like, I don't know, 7.8 Hong Kong dollars to the US dollar. That's what it's always been. In Argentina, it was 1-to-1. And then sort of an extension of that commitment is, well, if that's the case, if you respect property rights, then people should be able to just hold assets in bank accounts with whatever currency they want. And then if everybody says, well, the peso is the same thing as a dollar, then people can hold dollars. And so basically, if everybody completely believed in the system, they wouldn't have worried. Oh, I'll just hold pesos because I know it's the same thing. But they didn't. They held dollars, right? Which tells you something, right? So everybody had dollars. It didn't matter because the system was 1-to-1 and it was working. Everyone was respecting it. And it worked for ages, for not ages, but for like, I don't know, 7 years, whatever it was. It came down to about 1996, 1997, 97, 98, when the Asian financial crisis happened, which then led to, other parts of the world, Russia, and then famously in 1999, it hit the Brazilian real. Okay, so that's how we bring Brazil into the story.
All right, there's a connection.
And the Brazilian real was heavily devalued. And what does Brazil do? It competes directly with Argentina for the sale of agricultural products and for cross-border purchases of its own. So here's Argentina stuck in this heavy recession that was happening because it had to price its goods at a significantly higher level than Brazil was, because it couldn't, because they were essentially cited in dollars, right? You can't immediately devalue in the same way they did. And then at the same time, they were, interest rates were ridiculously high because the US, if anyone remembers, everything was sort of flooding. The US was actually in the middle of its dot-com boom at the time and was surging while the rest of the world was tanking, which is part of the whole problem with the global financial system as far as I'm concerned, and why the dollar as the central piece of it is a problem. But anyway, I digress. That situation meant that Argentina was now suffering under very high interest rates and an excessively overvalued currency at a time when the rest of its competitors and everything else were now sort of devaluing and doing as well as they could within that environment. That is a recipe for brutal deflation, and that's literally what happened. Argentina started shrinking, and it was an extreme recession. It was a depression basically that went on for a number of years, and it had to go on for a number of years because the only way to get out of it was to break the peg between the dollar and the peso. But to do so would be a mortal sin from the perspective of all of the banks, all the property right holders, everyone who'd set up all their contracts, everything written in dollars. You'd have to write the whole thing off and make a massive cut. And that's what they did. They basically froze everyone's bank accounts. They cut it all out. It was a disaster. And that's where you've seen all the famous images of people putting ladrones, thieves, and it's just graffiti over every bank and having to board up all the banks with the first day I got there, I walked down, this was in 2003 after it had happened, but the banks were still freezing everybody's money, and there were just daily protests and people throwing paint and crazy. It was chaos. This is the moment when the then president Fernando de la Rua had to escape from the Plaza de Mayo in a helicopter because the hordes were gathering at the edges.
Oh my gosh!
Was disastrous because you tied this thing rigidly to a system that could not be broken. So it will fix the problem of inflation, but what happens the next time that Argentina is out of the cycle? And that's one of the things that Malay has put out there. Purists who believe in currency boards will say, well, the deflationary mechanism just needs to be faster because it's yet another way to just devalue, right? just devalue by cutting all the prices. If you cut prices and you create, it's the pain you have to pay because you're being undisciplined. It doesn't work like that. Politics is really difficult. And the system's supposed to be this tough love structure that then forces fiscal austerity when you have to, et cetera, et cetera. But Argentina's politics is not going to let that happen easily because it's run by a bunch of corrupt Peronists who will not give up on their patronage and their systems. So it feels like a magic bullet. And I've seen it happen, and I don't imagine how a place that has tried to fix its problems for 100 years and can't will somehow magically do it this time, whereas they weren't able to do it in the 90s.
Well, the thing I find fascinating about Argentina is just that it's really like the only country of the modern era that at least I can think of that 100 years ago it was one of the most wealthiest countries in the world, right? Yeah. It was
an expression as rich as an Argentine. It was an expression back in the day.
And even if you looking at like Buenos Aires, if you looking at just the architect, you can tell like, wow, this is like a Paris type city, right? This is very it's like a cultural center, it's a financial center, it's all these things. They have they have no like natural enemies except for the British maybe in the Falkland Islands.
Resources up the wazoo, right? They've got copper, they've got oil, they've got wind, and they got everything renewable. They've got the most fertile land in the world, in the Pampas. Everything blessed.
And then you look at it and you're like, okay, these guys did something to just sort of not only just squander away that advantage that they had 100 years ago, but then they've also arrived at this place where like with the situation you're just describing, where the president has to be like airlifted out because people are protesting because they can't get their money out of the banks, and and I guess it's really just like the prime example of like why things like Bitcoin came into, like why people are passionate about things about like Bitcoin, right? It's like this is the type of situation you want to get out of, but. I mean, not to like turn this into a entire like history lesson here, but I mean, how did they end up from this point of like extreme wealth to just extreme, like just madness? Because
you have to have, and the 20th century was built upon this premise that you follow a structure of trusted government to steward a market capitalist system. Right, that you have to have a structure around that to make it work, and they just never were able to create a trusted government. The bigger question is how and why, right? Like why was Argentina unable to actually do this? And I have my own theories that in fact, like people actually compare Argentina to Australia, my home country, and just say they're very similar countries, both settler societies, and they have resource wealth. Those two qualities should mean that, and they were both similarly wealthy at the beginning of the 20th century, and then one continued to rise, and the other one went down. And my theory is that it actually goes down to the structure of the government societal compact, right? Literally the covenant that existed or failed to exist because of the particular moments of colonial history that they each had. Argentina's began a lot earlier. It was founded by it was basically a religious bunch of, fanatics who went in there and decided they were just going to wipe out all of the local population in these Indian wars that spread across the Pampas, and they just handed massive tracts of land to the generals who'd fought those wars. So it was just like this literally the conquest of everything in a brutal fashion that led to this absolutely inefficient system where one guy sits on a massive amount of rich land and could just get wealthy on the back of that. But you don't create innovation or creativity or a different system around that, and you create inequality that then leads to dysfunctional government. Whereas Australia, just by hook or crook, it doesn't mean it's fair or not, but the British Crown came in and declared the whole thing terra nullius, even though there were Aboriginals living there. And therefore the entire Crown claimed every bit of land and then would parcel out on a small basis to all of the different landowners, small pieces to make something of what they had. That led to a more middle-class egalitarian society. then you get a functional government because you can build a democracy on that basis. So there's a whole other political science conversation around why Argentina was a screw up. That's my theory. And then then when things happened in the 20th century and they had to sort of figure out where they sat, with whether they pro-Germany or pro-Britain in the midst of the Nazis and Second World War, they can't make decisions. Everything it gets down to that dysfunctional state, which then leads to the failure of your monetary system. If you have a failed government, you have a failed monetary system, which is why I think looking at the state of democracy around the world, particularly in the US, this is where you can ask tough questions about eventually, does the dollar fall from its perch and does it face the crisis because of the faith in government that is being undermined by a failure of democracy? So,
when you look at some of the differences in countries that are, generally like have very similar demographics and kind of historical trajectories and resource allotments and things, a lot of it does kind of go back to what happened in those early days. And I think in a case of like Argentina, like, okay, where if what you're describing, where it's like, okay, these huge plots of land were just parceled out to, generals or friends of the king or whatever. And, in an agrarian society, you obviously have like industrial, production and things, but still heavily agrarian. You can have a pretty like large economy, pretty wealthy economy just along those systems. But to your point, where when you have these, what's almost kind of like a feudal type society, like there's just not a recipe for innovation there. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's almost kind of like looking at in the U.S., like you have before the Civil War, you had the North versus the South, where the South was basically just like a feudal plantation society. All the innovation, all the factories were in the North. Mm-hmm. That's where all the wealth ended up kind of congregating. So once like World War II hit, and then once the Peronists came into power right around World War II, if I'm not mistaken, no Argentine history, but that seems like that's kind of when everything sort of really started going downhill. Like they came in with, hey, we're going to do industrial policy, we're going to do import substitution, and we have all these great ideas, and then it's like once you get into this cycle, like you just can't get out of it, right? Mm-hmm. And it seems like the Peronists have just been, they've basically been in power for the last 70 years now, right? There's been maybe
it's changed government, but at the end of the day, you can't govern without the Peronists supporting you. They control Congress, or at least they control a lot of the governorships within the biggest provinces, and it's an entire system of patronage too, right? It's all these vote buying systems, and it's like it's the machine. It's just Peronism is interesting. It's not really ideological. It's not neither left nor right. It's really just a machine. Menem, who was a Peronist in the 90s and ran that whole pro-capitalism, pro-Wall Street system under the currency board, was a Peronist, and so was Nestor Kirchner, who ended up running it through the 2000s. They hated each other, but they were part of the same machine. So yeah, it's so this is why again Bitcoin is very interesting from this perspective. It's what is the idea that if you have a failed government, and that ultimately growth and opportunity come from people being able to make what they will with their own assets and their own opportunities, then fix the money by actually taking it out of the hands of the government and handing it over to this sort of math-based protocol, and then let people, use that system of quote unquote monetary governance, right? A protocol-based governance system to then coordinate all of their activities with each other and start building things in the way that we've seen successful capitalist societies work. So it's an attractive notion, which is why I think it's done so much better in terms of adoption in Argentina than lots of other countries, because so many people get it. It just makes sense to them.
This kind of dovetails into my next question here is that we have seen like a disproportionate amount of adoption and also just entrepreneurship coming out of in the Bitcoin crypto space coming out of Argentina, right? Even dating back to Wences Cáceres and Zappo, who was really like the first, one of the guys who was like really kind of brought Bitcoin like to the mainstream, basically made a Bitcoin a thing in the Silicon Valley VC circles and whatnot. And, even kind of dating up to today, where you have, guys like, like Sebastian Serrano, Ripio, and like, the RSK guys. And like, there's like a lot of very, like like you've got the entrepreneurs and you also have like the adoption, right? Like you go to stores in Argentina and people will take Tether. They'll accept Bitcoin for payments. This is sort of something that people just get, right? It's so wondering if you could maybe just reflect on that, like how just in the same way that people back in the day, they had to find creative ways to get their hands on like physical dollar greenbacks. Now we're seeing creative ways where people can get their hands on things like Tether or things like Bitcoin. Like Sebastian, I had him on the show recently. He was telling me how at Repio, they have a service where they basically function like a bank where I can have my paycheck like directly deposited into my Repio account, and boom, it just automatically converts my salary from pesos into USDT or into Bitcoin or whatever. Just like boom, like so. Minimizing the exposure at all costs to the local currency, basically. And people are using this stuff, right? So wondering if you can kind of reflect on like, kind of merging your two lives here together, your crypto, life and then your Argentina life. Like how have you seen, the Argentine population and this ecosystem really embrace this technology?
Yeah, there's two things going on here. I had, Sebastian Stoner was one of my favorite people around then, and I wrote about them. They were called Bitpagos initially, right from the very beginning of their operations, because it struck me as something that was so unique to Argentina, and I could see how here was Bitcoin solving a problem. I can explain what that is in a moment, but to more directly, I had Santiago Siri, who's one of the leaders of the sort of crypto movement within Argentina as well. On our podcast a while ago, and we just talked about why, in fact, there is so much entrepreneurship as well, right? It's not just that the story makes sense from their own experience; it's that you have a couple of things going on. One is that, to your point earlier, Argentina is still actually relatively wealthy, and weirdly, again, because of, I think, this sort of, it's very unequal, very, it's not like the wealth is well spread, but inside Capital Federal, the city of Buenos Aires, and literally the 3.5 million people or so who live within the federal district, it's actually relatively middle class. So the wealth that is created elsewhere floods in and has, because of the structure of the city, you've got a large, well-educated, innovative group of people, and so they're smart and they're very creative, and this is the other piece of it, they're also extremely creative around money. They are the most interesting financial engineers because they've had to deal with this money crisis throughout history, and Argentines have always got the most radical way to trade this, importing used cars, because the car is going to be sold in dollars, and that therefore it's actually a form of capturing the value without actually having to exchange the currencies, right? And then selling the car for dollars and getting your dollars that way, right? All of these sorts of tricks and things is going off to the casino in Uruguay and buying chips on a credit card and getting dollars and then sort of smuggling them across the river and on the bookie bus, right? People have done all these things for years, and so they're very creative around how do you solve for money problems. At the same time that they are educated, a lot of them have there's a lot of there's good engineering schools, there's good economic schools, all of that, at least within that pocket of the city, has led to this sort of burgeoning, crowd. The whole country, 39 million worth, are all out there in the provinces, stuck within a much more patronage-driven system. But that innovation has been really important. And then, so Santiago's thing, it was a classic example of it. It was so innovative. Essentially, the problem was not what is not the usual thing, where it's the locals. It wasn't the problem that was being solved in the US, where if I wanted to pay, I had Bitcoin and I wanted to pay for something in Bitcoin, what was it? BitPay and these other early providers back when this thing was created, they would immediately convert the thing into dollars so that the merchant that you were getting it would actually not have to take Bitcoin, right? It would be this exchange that would happen there. And then so the hotel or whatever you'd pay with Bitcoin, they'd get dollars. That was the structure.
In Argentina, it's the inverse. It's like they don't want the locals.
Hotels did not want pesos. They wanted the dollars from the incoming tourists who were bringing their credit cards, and they were saying, oh, I don't want to get dollars, but the government wouldn't let them. If you took it in pesos, if you took it in the credit card or anything, you'd have to go through the banking system, and the only way you could do that was at the onerous rate that the government was charging you. So it was like, well, no, we'll get these people to come in dollars, and then we'll immediately convert them bitpagos, as it was called, into pesos, and into Bitcoin, and then transfer the Bitcoin to the hotel. And then the hotel would figure out how to move from Bitcoin into pesos if they wanted to, or whatever. So it was, it really sort of flipped it all around and saw things from that innovative perspective, that only an Argentine would possibly see as a solution.
And stories like this, I think, are really illustrative because they do kind of highlight what at least I see as the key, redeeming feature of crypto is that it does provide kind of an opt-out situation for people. Like it's an off-ramp, even if it's not, it might not necessarily be scalable most of the time for most people. It might not necessarily be accessible to all people all the time. But if people are willing to do a little bit of the legwork, put in a little bit of the homework, they can figure out how to use these things. It can function as kind of like that life raft, right? And it's super interesting hearing these stories, and even experiencing these types of situations in parts of the world where this is just the financial reality for people, right? Where in the US, we've just been, a lot of these problems are just things that we don't experience on a day-to-day basis. So it seems kind of trivial. It's like, oh, why do I need a new way of payment? My credit card works fine, right? So people have a hard time kind of really understanding the use case for something like cryptocurrency, aside from just a speculation tool, right? Where in places like this, what you're describing is this is literally somebody's, their entire life savings potentially. This could be this is the only way they can really protect their wealth sometimes. So I think it's really illustrative to have these, to kind of be reminded of these types of this is sort of the why are we here, right? Mm-hmm. And as much as I love the country of Argentina and I wish them all the best, I am kind of in some ways sort of thankful for their it probably sounds terrible, but I'm thankful that we could use them as an example for okay, why is this stuff necessary, right? Mm-hmm. And it's funny, I was even in my interview with Sebastian, I was asking him oh, so what do you think kind of the best thing that what could Javier Milei do to really support crypto in the country, right? Mm-hmm. And he had some sort of answer, and but after the interview, I was that was kind of a really stupid question, because the best thing that he could do for the country, for crypto, or for the best thing he could do for crypto would just be to keep doing what the previous administration was doing, which is hyperinflation. And that's the best way to get adoption of crypto, is just to keep that same environment.
Yeah, it's one of the great ironies, isn't it? It's a broader, oh, yay, let's call for total economic and monetary dysfunction.
If you want mass adoption of crypto, just call for total economic, just hyperinflation and mass ruin, and people will flock to crypto. I guess that's one way to do it. Yeah. Well, anyway, Michael, would love to, maybe just give you some final thoughts here. If I don't know how, versed you are in the Brazil scene at all, but if you have any thoughts on Brazil or kind of how you see crypto panning out in other developing economies around the world. We would love your thoughts on any of that. And then, I understand you've got a new book coming out as well. So if you want to give a quick plug for that.
Yes, I can chill that a bit. But on the developing, Argentina is the most extreme version of a problem that exists everywhere, right? We're just seeing, think of the utter horrible images emerging out of Haiti, for example. Sheila and I, on our podcast, did a special on Haiti and its own deep-seated financial problems. Let me highlight this. Haiti's in the news, right? So let's think about where its deep financial problems come from. In whatever year it was when was the slave rebellion? But in any case,
1803 or something, or early.
Right. So first absolute uprising. These human beings taking charge of their lives and overthrowing their slave owners. Is a very, very important moment in the history of the abolitionist movement and the establishment of an independent, free state for people who deserve to be free. No one could dispute the value of that, right? Well, at the time, the way that the French government that was basically, Haiti needed money. and the French government saw themselves as representing the slave owners, or as they would put it, the property owners who'd been denied their property by the property themselves, right? The human beings were the property who stood up and said, we deserve to have freedom. And the government, well, that's fine, but you owe us money now because you've taken our property away from us. And that was established as a debt, a massive debt that Haiti had to pay. And for 130, 40 years, that debt got rescheduled, restructured, everything else was eventually picked up by a bank that then became Citibank, right? This debt was just hanging. It wasn't retired until, I don't know, the 1950s or something like that. They finally just forgave the debt. But it was a retrograde, massive drag on Haiti's development for all of that time, because of this utterly unfair notion that the slaves owed the slave owners something from taking away their property. And that's the way that the global financial system recognized that debt. I can't, and I think about this, I can't think of anything more fundamentally unfair than that in terms of, this sort of financial story. So, these systems are there across so many developing countries, and it's not, in so many cases, their fault. Like the classic, hardline Chicago school view is like, well, we'll just be more disciplined and stop blowing money away. But it refuses to acknowledge the deep-seated antecedents to where all of these things come from in the first place. So these countries have every right to think about new alternative models. And to sort of say, to hell with you, IMF, or these other systems that actually are the story of debt that they have been stuck under is part of very similar, if not always as extreme, stories as Haiti's story. And so I think there's an entire realm of conversation. This is one of the things that Bukele talks about in El Salvador, like breaking free of that sort of strictures of debt and using these tools like Bitcoin to actually to break free of that. So I think these are very real and legitimate concerns that I think will continue to underpin the opportunities for crypto in the developing world. And one of the reasons why you do see it emerge from a lot of different politicians in those sorts of countries embracing these ideas. At the same time, there are all these dictatorships in a lot of these places that are terrified of Bitcoin because it's a runaround to their own control. Nigeria is a classic case of like now trying to impose, it's like,
well, they like imprisoned these Binance guys, right? Yeah. Like they just arrested these guys for like no reason.
Yeah. So it's a real flash. The developing world is a massively important flashpoint for the proving ground of these ideas, these crypto concepts, and it will continue to be so. There's no way in the world this is going to get any easier. It's going to continue to have all this tension. So it's really just saying, watch this space. And Brazil's part of that. I mean, Brazil's got massive problems and, a lot of political tension. So, and the government's experimenting with different digital payment systems and, the central banks sort of, I think it's actually doing some innovative things that I think are quite interesting. But all of that comes up against the backdrop of these political and financial tensions that are ever present and will, aren't going to go away soon.
These things are always like so complicated, right? Like it's never such, like the Chicago boys, example of like, oh, you just need more, fiscal austerity and it'll solve all your problems or whatever. It's like, no, these are like complicated. There's many more factors involved in these problems than
and rights. And it's and legitimate gripes that these countries have.
Yeah. And it's not just a question of like, oh, we can, and because these structures exist, it doesn't just mean the solution is as simple as like, I think you see a lot of like the technologists, like the tech bro guys on Twitter who are just like, oh, we just need more innovation. We'll just innovate our way out of all these problems. Yeah. And it's like, well, like, for like, the top 10% of the population, they'll just be just fine. But like, what about everybody else? Right. Yeah. So I think, all these questions have to be kind of, wrestled with a bit more drastically. So I appreciate your point of view here. And why don't you just give a quick plug for your new book coming out?
Oh, yeah. Wrap it up here. It's a very different topic, but it's indirectly connected, I suppose. This book is called Our Biggest Fight. I co-wrote it with the businessman, Frank McCourt, who is the founder of Project Liberty. It's a project to try to fix the internet, to break down another source of sort of dictatorship type power. We actually use the word feudalism to describe the internet's current siloed controls amongst these massive social media platforms that have controlled our data. And we're arguing that we need to take charge of our data. So the book's called Our Biggest Fight, Reclaiming Liberty, Dignity, and Humanity in the Digital Age. And it's out now, and really excited about it. I think it's it's a manifesto. It's trying to say to folks, we need to change this system because you're being manipulated. You've lost your agency. You've lost your own kind of control of your lives, and it's undermining our democracy, and it's threatening, our own freedoms. So, it's our biggest fight. It's a big one. It's a big fight.
It is indeed. Well, Michael, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's really amazing just hearing your story here, and I'm glad we were able to kind of dive into some. I've heard all these stories in like bits and pieces before, just from having like worked with you for so many years, but I've never actually sat you down for an hour and picked your brain on this stuff. So it's good to have that opportunity.
Always like Argentina. Yeah.
So appreciate your time. And how can folks find you if they want to get in touch?
Yep. Mike J. Casey on Twitter. Just look me up on LinkedIn. Those two places are probably the most active I am. I'm not really as out there on all the others. But you can
Perfect.
Easy enough. Michael Casey on Twitter.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Okay, well, great. Thank you so much for your time, Michael, and thanks to everyone for listening. And
go to ourbiggestfight.com. Sorry, go ourbiggestfight.com. That's a good place to go and look up what the book's all about.
Ourbiggestfight.com. Perfect. Okay, well, great. Well, thanks so much, Michael, for your time, and thanks to everyone for listening, and we will see you all next time.
Thanks, Aaron.